love that the big guys join the fight.
Welcome back, everyone. Transformers Rise of the Beast was just released. Hopefully you've had a chance to see it. I got a lot of questions about the post-credit scenes. There are 2 of them in the big crossover they're teasing, so we'll break it all down. If you're brand new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to get all the videos. And careful for spoilers if you have not seen Rise of the Beast yet, since we're talking about the ending of the movie. But during the ending, Optimus Prime, Optimus Primal, with the help of the Beast Wars Transformers, the Maximals, stop Unicron from using the Transwarp Key to travel to the Milky Way galaxy, Earth's galaxy. They never say which part of the universe Unicron was coming from. Because of all the Easter eggs and references during the movie, we know that it wasn't near Cybertron, because during the movie, both Optimus Prime and Optimus Primal references saying that they don't want Unicron to get the key, not only because he can use it to travel anywhere in time and space, giving him theoretically infinite worlds to feed on, but Unicron could also use it to find Cybertron and try to consume it. Here's the thing though, Cybertron is literally the body of Unicron's twin, Primus, who's meant to be just as powerful as Unicron. I'll explain how Primus became Cybertron later in the video, just because it's a whole big thing, because the whole idea is that Unicron versus Primus would be like the Transformers version of Avengers Endgame. It would be like the last big thing that they do. You're talking about 2 god-level Transformers going to war with each other, 2 planet-sized Transformers battling it out. There are a couple points in the movie where Scourge and the Terrorcons reference Primus, even though the Transformers themselves, like Optimus Prime, doesn't reference Primus himself. But I do think they're working up to more Primus stuff. I think that's why they're mentioning him in the movie, like, oh yeah, we're gonna do Primus eventually too. But once they destroy the key, Unicron's trapped in the other galaxy, Anthony Ramos' character Noah Diaz interviews for a new job, which is a random business. He doesn't know exactly what he's interviewing for, he just thinks it's for a regular job. He enters a common import-export business, travels down the stairs to a meeting room where he meets an Agent Burke, who isn't from the original Transformers or G.I. Joe canon. He's meant to be like a totally new character. Unless he was using some alias in the scene, like he could wind up being somebody from the G.I. Joe canon. But he starts interviewing Noah for the job, joking about the gaps, quote-unquote, in his resume. Like when they start talking about his recent job time in Peru, Burke lets him know that he's been monitoring what he and the other Transformers were doing there, and he knows everything. Like he and the people that he works with, the G.I. Joe characters, know all about Optimus Prime, all the Transformers, Unicron, the Maximals, the Transwarp Key, everything. He says he works for a covert government agency that would like all of them, Noah and his large Transformer friends, to work with them because of an ongoing war that they're in the middle of. They start panning around the room as Noah starts getting confused and anxious. You start noticing G.I. Joe Easter eggs on the wall, all these plaques, all these signs. There's even a plaque that reads, "Real American Hero," which is the G.I. Joe slogan. Which Burke then shifts, activating a door, revealing an underground hangar bay with a bunch of advanced technology, ships, and weapons. He hands him a card to contact him when he decides, when he says yes, and the G.I. Joe symbol is on the back. So they're basically saying the next Transformers movie sequel will be a Transformers G.I. Joe crossover, and they're connecting the Hasbro cinematic universe. If you haven't been following Transformers and G.I. Joe for a while, you probably heard talk of them doing a crossover for a long time, like this toy cinematic universe. They did a version of this in the Marvel Universe with Secret Wars back in the 80s. It was their way of doing like a giant Avengers Endgame level movie before they were doing those giant Marvel movies. Like they needed a reason to sell toys, so they wanted to do this giant event, and that became Secret Wars. But it was mostly for the purposes of selling all these toys. They did the same thing in the Star Wars universe in the 90s with Shadows of the Empire because it was before the prequels had come out. So if you've been following the G.I. Joe movies, the Transformer movies for a long time, or you've just been fans of the toys, the TV shows for years and years and years, there's been talk about them doing this crossover for a long time. But the reason why the producers said that they didn't do it before this is because they couldn't figure out how to do it logically without it just feeling like a total cash grab. This is the producer of that next Transformers and G.I. Joe crossover movie talking about it.
You know, we've talked about it for a long time, and the fans have been, you know, really rabid about it, which is great, you know, and so it makes you want to do it. We never found a really organic way to do it. And I think one of the things is you just don't want to do it in a way that feels, I'll say, cynical, you know, that you're just jamming in it because there's more fans and the fans are going to like it, you know. So what happened was Anthony's story, the story of Noah, is a character who is having a hard time because of life getting a job. And it just felt like so organic that what job is he going to finally break through with? G.I. Joe. The way I would look at it, and I think the way we understand it, is the Maximals, we barely touched the surface. So we really got to bring them into the story in a way, into the continuation of the story. And then we'll introduce some Joe characters. So it'll be kind of a group, if you would. What mission they're going to go on, we don't know. What's the task? Who are we saving it from? We don't know. So we're not going to add a host of Maximals or a host of G.I. Joes or a host of Autobots. We're going to try to keep the group somewhat tight. Do we bring a new Duke in? Do we bring a new, it's hard to think about exactly some of the ones we've done, although they absolutely could exist in this world. So Snake Eyes is probably my favorite Joe. So maybe Snake Eyes will fit very organically here.
So during his little talk there, he seems pretty clear when he's setting up what's happening in that G.I. Joe's Transformers crossover movie. It's more of a Transformers movie, focusing on more of the Maximals with some of the key Transformers like Optimus Prime and Bumblebee in a couple of the G.I. Joe characters, a couple of the big G.I. Joe characters. So it's not like they're going to ram in like every single G.I. Joe character ever, and it's not going to be more of a G.I. Joe movie with Transformers in it. It'll feel more like a Transformers movie with G.I. Joe characters folded into it. He does seem pretty certain that Snake Eyes and probably Duke are going to be in that movie, so I think that confirms my theory about them rebooting part of the timeline for the G.I. Joe movies. The whole war that they were talking about that G.I. Joe was meant to be in the middle of fighting and needed the Transformers' help for was against Cobra, obviously, because we're talking about G.I. Joe here. Who's G.I. Joe going to fight a war against but Cobra? There aren't any huge Cobra references that I could see in that post-credit scene, but if you spotted any, or any in the wall, or any in their dialogue, just write them below in the comments. They haven't done any G.I. Joe live-action movies set earlier in the timeline, around the 80s and the 90s, when they started doing the Bumblebee movie reboot, and now this movie, which is set in the 90s. But the whole idea with the Bumblebee reboot was rebooting the Transformers timeline so they could change whatever they wanted to. Like, Bumblebee was meant to be a soft reboot, even though there seems like there are loose connections with the Michael Bay Transformers. I think the idea with them doing this Transformers G.I. Joe crossover sequel next is that they will do the same thing for the G.I. Joe movie timeline. They'll reboot that. Like, they had the Snake Eyes movie recently, but it did terribly. Like, it bombed big time, and I think they're just ready to move on with something totally different, and this is the opportunity to do that. So because they've never done G.I. Joe movies set earlier in the timeline, they can reintroduce or introduce versions of the characters earlier in the timeline, and it won't break anything just because it will be a reboot. So like Duke, Cobra Commander, all the other characters, anybody they want to introduce, they can do earlier now. Really good example of that is like John Cena's character in Bumblebee. Even though he's not meant to be Duke, they could just say that he's playing a version of Duke, or he's playing another totally different character that just winds up going to work for G.I. Joe at some point after the Bumblebee movie. Speaking of the Bumblebee movie, they were also going to include Haley Steinfeld's Charlie character from that movie during Rise of the Beasts early on, but plans fell through at some point. Even Haley Steinfeld was confused about that. She's like, yeah, why am I not in this Transformers Rise of the Beasts movie? They did say that Charlie would come back in the movies eventually, and they're probably saving some of the Bumblebee story for that too, because Mirage, for example, was a much bigger character during this than Bumblebee was, and usually you would expect Bumblebee to get a lot of that story. But the whole idea here with the timeline is that they have till about 2006 when that first Michael Bay Transformers movie came out to play with, so 10 years worth of timeline to play in. What I'm expecting though, is that in a couple years they'll announce when they're going to release this Transformers G.I. Joe movie, and it'll probably still be set during the 90s. I don't think they want to jump the timeline forward too much, like a little time jump after this movie, which was in 1994, so maybe the crossover movie is in 1995 or 1996. Then in the next post-credit scene, there's another time jump after the interview with the G.I. Joe characters. Noah's in another garage with Reek, who's been helping him assemble the parts to build a new version of Mirage's body, which was a Porsche 964 Carrera RS 3.8. I don't think you could actually buy those in the United States during the 90s. I think you actually could only get those in Europe. He also uses the parts that Mirage gave him to create his Transformers suit. Like, Mirage had transferred his essence into the suit, even though they were kind of coy about that. Like, wait a minute, is he still alive inside the suit or something like that? But the idea is that he wasn't destroyed in the final fight, just parts of his body. Once the car is finished being assembled, Mirage reveals that he's been alive this whole time, and the car begins to transform. But it's a bit of a Bumblebee situation where he looks all beat up because the car parts were all from secondhand, different color Porsches. But it just means Mirage will be back in that next Transformers and G.I. Joe crossover movie. Just to explain the whole Unicron versus Primus thing though, like that's something that's probably way further off in the Transformers sequels. Unicron and his twin brother Primus are sort of like the twin gods of the Transformer multiverse. Unicron is more of like a dark god of the Transformers, and Primus is like the light side god creator of all Transformers. That includes all factions of the Transformers, like all the Autobots, as well as the Decepticons, the Predacons, the Maximals, every different version of Transformers that evolved over time. So them doing Unicron is sort of them going back to the origin of the Transformers multiverse. They actually just announced that they're actually doing a movie about the origin of the Autobots and the Decepticons called Transformers 1, with Chris Hemsworth, of all people, playing young Optimus Prime. They'll also probably use some of that movie to explain the origin of Cybertron, as well as the origin of Primus and his brother Unicron. So I think the idea is that when they decide to do their Avengers Endgame level type of event, like the big movie, they will bring Unicron back, and he will fight a version of Primus Cybertron. Think of all the toys they'll sell during that movie. RIP to everyone's wallets. A lot of big stuff coming up in the next week too. All my Flash videos, there's a bunch of stuff I'm working on for that movie, so those will be posting soon, and my Marvel Secret Invasion episodes will be starting soon. Click here for that full opening scene from Secret Invasion Episode 1, and click here for my new Flash Superman trailer video with Henry Cavill's Superman. Thank you so much for watching, everyone stay safe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
Transformers!